2024 is almost over and I'm not ready. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if you're new here. Hi, my name is Liz. Today we are going to do kind of an end of year recap where I'm just going to share with you guys all of my 5-star reads and also all of my DNFs. So we're going to see the highs and we're going to see the lows of 2024. Without further ado, let's get into the video. So the way I'm going to do this video, I have quite a few 5 stars that I want to talk about. I have 14 5-star reads from this year and I also have 3 DNFs. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about each book. I'm just going to share what the book was and give a few thoughts on each of the books. I don't want to turn this into a super long video, and a lot of these 5-star rates I could go on and on about, but I'm trying to restrain myself a little bit and just give kind of like the general feelings I had towards each of these books. This will be a great video for me to look back on for myself personally, just to see what my thoughts were on certain books this year and this time of my life. It's very, very hard for me to rate a book 5 stars. I haven't had a 5-star read in like 2 months, so it's a long time to go without a single 5-star. I've had a few that came really, really close, like 4.5, 4.75 even, but nothing has reached that 5-star feeling in the past 2 months, which is very unfortunate. I still have hopes that by the end of this year, I might have 1 or 2 more by the time I release this video. I'm hoping that I'm able to read. There's some books that I have on my list that I want to read before the end of the year that I'm hoping are 5 stars, but it's okay. I feel good going into 2025, especially with the 5-star reads I do have, and I'm really, really excited to talk about them. First up, we have Divine Rivals and Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. These were the first 2 books I read this year. I loved them. The world is a fantasy world set kind of what feels like in like the 1940s, 1950s almost. It definitely feels like a historical fantasy, and I really, really loved that about this book. The setting had me hooked, just where we're at with our main characters being writers and they're carrying their typewriters to and from work. Also, I felt like the romance was so wholesome. I feel like a lot of romances nowadays, they just kind of jump right into all of like the lust. I fell in love with these characters from the very, very beginning. And also, I just feel like the writing in this book was so beautiful. It was very lyrical, and the world, it just sucked me in. It made me feel like I was in this story, and I really, really enjoyed these 2 books. Next, I have A Dawn of Onyx by Kate Golden. This was the 3rd book I read in 2024. So I started off the year with 3 5-star reads, which is crazy to me. This is another fantasy world. The reason why I gave it 5 stars is because it was so fast paced from the very beginning. Also, the romance, the banter, and the chemistry between the 2 main characters was outstanding. I was rooting for them from the very, very beginning. Definitely gave me similar vibes to Powerless by Lauren Roberts. Also, this story had all of the best tropes. Any trope you can think of that's in a fantasy world that you might like is in this book. Next, we have The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston. This romance was just a beautiful story about finding yourself and figuring out what you want with your life. I feel like at the time that I read this book, it really resonated with me because I did end up leaving my career field. I ended up moving a few months later, and I feel like this book was kind of at the perfect time for me to read it because it just really hit really close to home, and I really, really enjoyed that about this story. I still think about this story and these characters, and I just have nothing but fond memories from when I read it. Next, we have A Curse of Saints by Kate Dramas. This is another fantasy world. I felt like it was nonstop action from page 1. Also, I felt like the main character, she was so incredibly strong. She definitely reminded me of our Throne of Glass main character, and I loved following along on her journey. Also, I felt like the enemies to lovers in the story was done very tastefully. It felt very realistic, and also the timing and the pacing with our characters, watching them go from enemies to lovers, I felt like the pacing was just done very, very well, and I really, really enjoyed it whenever it finally stopped being a slow burn. And also, I really fell in love with the unique magic system in this world. I felt like it was a lot different than your typical fantasy, and that's part of the reason why I felt so immersed while I was reading the story. Next, we have The Long Game by Elena Armas. This is another romance. This romance just felt very, very genuine. I felt like our 2 main characters, you get to see them grow together, and I really loved that. I felt like it was just very sweet. I loved seeing their paths intertwine. I loved seeing them kind of being forced to get along every single day. They got to go make a lot of memories together throughout the story, which I felt like just like further connected their bond. Also, the story had just amazing side characters. It was a very small town. I felt like all of the characters were kind of in it together, and I loved seeing that throughout the story. I also eventually read The Fiance Dilemma, which is the 2nd book after that one, and it follows some side characters from the 1st book. I also loved that one. I didn't give that one 5 stars, but it was very, very close. I think I ended up giving like 4.5. Next, we have Happily Never After by Lynn Painter. I fell in love with this rom-com. It felt like a true rom-com. It felt like a true rom-com. Why can I not talk? It felt like a true rom-com in every sense of the word. It had me laughing, it had me giggling, it had me smiling. I thought it was very fast-paced. It was so bingeable. I think I finished it within a day. And I also loved that our couple in the story started out as friends, and you can see them slowly morph into more. Those are the best romances, whenever the two main characters start as friends, because it just really strengthens their bond and it really gives them a nice foundation to build off of. Next up, we have Heartless Hunter by Kristen Ciccarelli. This is another fantasy world, which basically takes Bridgerton and Robin Hood, and if they had a baby, that would be this book. I was so immersed in the story, the setting, everything about it. I felt like I was a part of it, and I am so incredibly excited for the second book. Next up, we have 3 books by Emily Henry, which big surprise, right? First up, I have Funny Story by Emily Henry. This story just felt so realistic. I felt like the two main characters were very relatable. If you've ever been broken up with or lost someone who is very important to you in your life, it felt like watching these two characters go through what they went through, their grieving process and everything, just felt so realistic. They had great chemistry as well. They had such a beautiful friendship throughout the whole story, and getting to heal together from the same heartbreak was really fun to read about. Also, our main character was a librarian. What's not to love? Next, I reread Beach Read by Emily Henry. I have made a vow to myself, I'm going to reread all of Emily Henry's books every single year, because every time I read them, I notice new things about the characters, or I feel like I connect to them in a different way than I did the first time I read them. And I am just so in love with her writing. Beach Read is one book that I've actually read it 3 times now, and I will never get tired of this story. I will never get tired of this romance. I love our two main characters in this book, and their story was so raw and beautiful and emotional at the same time. It made me cry, and it takes a lot to make me cry in a book. This one, I cry every time. Next, we have Happy Place by Emily Henry. Once again, another book that I feel like I could bawl my eyes out while reading every single time I read it. What I loved about this one that seemed very different and set it apart from her other romances is that this story follows mainly friendships. It follows like a friend group. I really enjoyed reading about this friend group and seeing how their dynamic changes over time as you add people into your group or as people leave and move on, if you are all spread out geographically, and seeing how you can still come together and still be friends even if you're all at different parts of your life. I'm kind of in a similar situation with friends where some of us live further apart, some are married, some are still single. Like, I feel like we're all at different stages, but we can all still come together and have just as much fun as we did when we were in college. I really loved this book. I felt like it was very beautiful. The story, second chance romance, was also really good to read about. I love reading second chance romances because you get to see how our characters evolve over time. You can see how they were once upon a time, and then they slowly, matured, or they learned new lessons in life that changed them a little bit, and seeing them come back together as new people is still very, very beautiful to read about. Also, this book takes place in Maine, my dream state. Next, we have Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez. I fell in love with this book from the very first page. Our main characters, I felt like, were just so funny. The way they talked back and forth was hilarious. I was laughing the entire time I was reading this book. While it was very funny, it also dealt with a lot of heavy and traumatic topics, and I feel like Abby Jimenez did a really great job handling those topics. I felt like she wrote about them in a very sensitive way. I feel like it was very relatable and very realistic as well to what a lot of people go through. Next up, we have When the Moon Hatched by Sarah Parker. This is another fantasy world, and this is a thick book, okay? I must say, before I read it, I was very intimidated by this story. I was afraid that I wasn't going to like it because I had heard a lot of people saying how it has very intense world building and there's a lot of characters. I kind of had to just let go and trust the process, and trust it I did. This was such a fully fleshed out fantasy world. I love that it was one story because I feel like the way things progressed and the pacing and where our story took us by the very end, it made sense that it was all in one book. And I'm very, very excited for the second book. Since I went in with such low expectations, I was pleasantly surprised by how much I loved this book and how fast I binge read this book. And the final 5-star of 2024, maybe, is the Mind F series by St. Abbey. This was another reread. I read this last year, still love it, still give it 5 stars. This was just such an addicting book to read. It talks about so many traumatic traumatic things. Don't get me wrong. Please read trigger warnings before you read this book. I felt like the whole story just took you on a wild ride from start to finish. It definitely tests your morals a little bit as well. And we're going to talk about some of the DNFs I had this year. Now, some of these books I do have plans to eventually try to read again. Some of them I don't. Let's talk about that. The first book that I DNF'd this year was Curious Tides. This is a fantasy world. The reason I DNF'd it was I was going into a book slump. I got like over 100 pages into this fantasy world and it still was kind of boring. Like it hadn't picked up yet. And since I was slipping into a book slump, I decided to put it down and find something else. I've heard that this has a crazy ending and the second book came out not too long ago. So I do want to eventually give this book a second chance because I feel like I could actually love this story and these characters if I gave them a chance. Sometimes it's just not the right timing to read a book. The second book I DNF'd was Swordcatcher. It's a thick read. Also, I was just bored. It had so many characters that it kind of lost me. There's other fantasy books that I've read where there's lots of characters, but that's never stopped me from reading. For whatever reason, this book could not get into it. I was so confused for the 100 and something pages I read. I don't think I'm going to try to pick it up again, unfortunately. I did read it because I was hoping I could get into Cassandra Clare's writing. I just don't know if it's for me. And the final book that I DNF'd this year, maybe, is Truly Madly Deeply by LJ Shen. I mainly listened to this as an audiobook and I hated this book so much. It felt like our two main characters, all they cared about was sex. I hated the guy character in this book. He's the big reason why I DNF'd it. I could not get past how horrible he was from the very first page. I have to like my main characters in order to want to keep reading about them. I could care less about this guy. I have no plans to try to reread this book. And that is it for my highs and my lows of 2024. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I always love reflecting back on my year and I always love seeing what other people thought about their reading and what were their top reads, what were their worst reads. I hope that 2025 I have more 5 stars, more than I got this year. I do feel like I got a lot, 14 5 stars. That's insane. That's crazy. And I only DNF'd 3, which I'm very impressed with myself. There were definitely a few books that I could have DNF'd but pushed through. I probably shouldn't have. I'm going to try to be better about not forcing myself to read books this year and read what I want to read and just have fun, honestly. Once again, thank you guys so much for watching and I will see you in, I was about to say 2025, but I think I have one more video before the end of 2024. So stick around. I will see you one more time before I see you next year. Happy reading. Bye.